A millionaire found a mother crying in the rain with her 2 newborn babies. When he brought them home, his maid revealed a secret about the mother. The night seemed endless. The storm raging over the small town in the interior of the United States was so fierce that it made the sky seem at war with itself. Lightning cut through the darkness, and thunder exploded, as if it wanted to devour the silence of the deserted road. Nicholas Bennett adjusted the windshield wipers, trying to keep his vision clear, but the water seemed to fall harder by the second. Driving down that road had never been part of his plans. He had left the office later than usual, and the main road was closed due to an accident. It wasn't the first time that his life, planned to the extreme, had been interrupted by unforeseen events that he hated. One more detour, he thought, as his fingers gripped the steering wheel impatiently. Nicholas was a man of 38 with hard features, but marked by a natural elegance. He wore an impeccable suit, and even at that moment alone, his posture was impeccable. He didn't allow anything out of place, neither in his appearance nor in his life. What others called loneliness, he called peace. He had never been a man to get emotionally involved. People described him as cold, a real iceberg, but Nicholas believed that compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford. But something that night was about to change. That's when the headlights illuminated the scene. In the middle of the road, he saw a figure, a woman completely drenched, with her arms wrapped around 2 small packages. At first, he thought it was an animal or some object left by the storm, but as he got closer, it became clear that it was a person. Nicholas slammed on the brakes, his heart inexplicably racing. "What the hell is she doing here?" he muttered to himself. It didn't make sense. There were no houses nearby, no stops, just kilometers of emptiness. He stopped the car a few meters from her, leaving the engine running, but remained inside the vehicle. She didn't move. She just looked at him, with big, desperate eyes. Her hair was dripping with water stuck to her face, and the clothes she was wearing were so wet they seemed to weigh tons. For a moment he thought about simply turning around and going on his way. It wasn't his problem, and helping someone, especially in this way, had never been part of his profile. But there was something about her. Perhaps it was the way she held those parcels against her chest, as if her life depended on them. Against his better judgment, Nicholas lowered the glass. "Are you all right?" he asked, but his voice sounded harsher than he had intended. "Please." Her voice was weak, almost inaudible over the sound of the rain. "My babies. They won't survive like this." "Babies?" He frowned, finally realizing that the bundles in her arms were actually 2 children, 2 little lives that, even from a distance, seemed too fragile to be facing that storm. Nicholas hesitated, looking around. The road was deserted. There was no one to help her. He looked back at her, who was now visibly shaking, and realized that she wouldn't be able to go on much longer. "Get in the car," he finally said, opening the passenger door. She hesitated, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing, but then took a shaky step forward and got in. As soon as she closed the door, the smell of rain and despair filled the vehicle. She held the babies so tightly that she seemed afraid they would disappear if she relaxed for a second. Nicholas started the car, not knowing exactly what he was doing. "Where do you live?" he asked. But she didn't answer. She was too focused on checking on the babies, trying to cover them with the pieces of cloth she had. "I asked you where you live," he repeated, now more firmly. She looked up at him, and he saw something he hadn't expected. Fear. Not just any fear, but something deep, almost desperate. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. Nicholas felt his stomach sink. He looked at the babies, who were now still, which frightened him even more. "They're alive, aren't they?" She nodded quickly, squeezing them against her. "Yes, but they're weak. They haven't had food for hours, and it's so cold. Please don't leave me." Nicholas had never been good at dealing with requests for help, and that one seemed to carry a weight he wasn't prepared to bear. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'll take you to my house. We have heating, food, then we'll see what to do." She let out a sigh that sounded like relief, but Nicholas knew he was getting into something complicated. He barely knew who she was, and now he had 3 strangers in his car, with his house being the only possible destination. When they finally arrived at the mansion, Clara, the housekeeper who had worked for him for years, met them at the door. She looked at the woman and the babies with a mixture of shock and concern, but said nothing. Clara knew that Nicholas wasn't the kind of man who made decisions without thinking, so if he had brought that woman home, he must have had a good reason. As Clara rushed to prepare something hot, Nicholas helped the woman inside, noticing for the first time how thin and haggard she was. She looked like she hadn't eaten for days. "You need to tell me who you are," he said, his voice as cold and calculated as ever. "My name is Sophie," she said at last, her voice low. "And all I wanted was to save my children." Nicholas looked at her, trying to find answers in her face, but before he could ask any more, Clara returned, pale, with an expression he had never seen before. "Mr. Bennett," she began, hesitantly. "That woman, I know her." Nicholas frowned, surprised. "What do you mean you know her?" Clara swallowed, casting a cautious glance at Sophie. "There's something you need to know about her." The tension in the air was almost palpable, and Nicholas felt his heart racing again. He knew in that instant that the presence of this woman and her children would bring much more than he was prepared for. Nicholas frowned, looking from Clara to Sophie as his patience rapidly waned. He was not a man who liked riddles, and Clara's hesitation only fueled his irritation. "Clara, what's going on? Explain yourself at once." His voice was firm, almost cutting. Clara took a deep breath, avoiding facing Sophie directly. There was something in her eyes that the housekeeper didn't seem to want to confront. "Mr. Bennett, I don't think this is the right time to talk about this. Miss Sophie and the babies need help now. Later, when everything is calmer, I'll explain everything." The tension hung in the air like a rope about to snap. Nicholas hated evasive answers. He knew that Clara, with her always ethical and reserved attitude, wasn't one to invent problems for no reason, but this was different. She was clearly upset, and that bothered him deeply. "After," Nicholas repeated with a hint of sarcasm. "Very convenient." He turned his attention to Sophie, who was now sitting on the sofa, with the baby still pressed against her chest. She seemed oblivious to what was going on, focused only on keeping them warm. "Do you know what she's talking about?" Nicholas asked Sophie directly. Sophie looked up at him, and for a brief moment, he saw something that disconcerted him. It wasn't just the fear she'd been carrying before, but something deeper, something that felt like guilt. But she shook her head, denying any knowledge. "I don't know what she's talking about," she muttered, her voice so low it was barely audible. Nicholas watched her for a few more seconds, trying to decipher her. He was a man who relied on logic, on facts, but nothing about the situation made sense. Who was this woman? How had she ended up in the middle of that storm with 2 newborn babies? And above all, why did Clara seem so nervous about her presence? But he decided not to press. Not yet. There was something too fragile about the situation to explode at that moment. "Clara, prepare something warm for her and see if you can get some dry clothes," he ordered, turning again to Sophie. "And you need to rest. There's no point in trying to look after the babies if you collapse first." Clara hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but eventually obeyed. She sorted some clothes that Sophie put on and then went into the kitchen, and the distant sound of dishes and pans echoed through the house. Nicholas stood in the middle of the room, crossing his arms as he watched Sophie with a critical eye. The minutes dragged by. Sophie held the babies, who were now asleep, but her eyes remained open, fixed on the floor. Nicholas noticed that she was shivering, perhaps from cold or nervousness, or both. He sighed, feeling a twinge of irritation at caring so much about a stranger. "How old are they?" he asked, breaking the silence. Sophie looked up, surprised by the question. She took a moment to answer. "A week," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Nicholas blinked, surprised. "A week? And you're on the road with them? That's crazy. They should be in hospital, at home, anywhere other than a storm in the middle of nowhere." She pressed her lips together as if trying to hold back tears. "I had no choice," she replied, her voice laden with a pain that Nicholas didn't know how to deal with. "Everyone has choices," he retorted automatically, but regretted it as soon as the words came out. Sophie shrugged, as if his words had hit something she was trying to hide. Before she could reply, Clara returned with a tray and a thick blanket. "Here you go," she said, handing over the tray with a bowl of hot soup and a glass of water. She then handed the blanket to Nicholas, who extended it to Sophie without a second thought. "Thank you," Sophie murmured almost helplessly, as she tucked the blanket around the babies and herself. She sipped the soup slowly, as if each spoonful was a struggle. Nicholas watched in silence, still standing. He didn't know what to do or how to act. There was something about her that disconcerted him, something that seemed to stir parts of him that he had thought were dead for years. He felt like asking more, demanding answers, but he knew that this wasn't the time. Clara, however, seemed restless. Her eyes ran from Sophie to Nicholas and then to the babies, as if she were analyzing every detail. There was something she knew, something she clearly wanted to say, but was hesitating. When Sophie had finished her soup, Clara picked up the tray and started to leave the room, but Nicholas called out to her. "Clara," he said, without taking his eyes off Sophie, "are you going to explain to me where you know Sophie from, or am I going to have to wait?" Sophie looked up, startled, and Clara stopped midway, holding the tray tightly. "Mr. Bennet, I don't think this is the right time. Please trust me. Miss Sophie needs to rest." "I'm not asking for your opinion," he replied, his voice cold and authoritative. Sophie looked nervous, clutching the babies to her, but said nothing. Clara, on the other hand, was motionless, clearly in an internal conflict. Finally, she sighed and spoke. "All I can say now, Mr. Bennet, is that this woman is no stranger." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Nicholas took a step forward, narrowing his eyes. "What do you mean, not a stranger to whom?" Clara swallowed, looking away. "To someone very important, but I can't say more. I'll talk to her first, Mr. Bennet." Nicholas felt a knot forming in his stomach. It didn't make sense. He looked at Sophie, who was now pale as if all the color had been drained from her face. "Is that true?" he asked directly to her. But Sophie shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears that she was clearly trying to hold back. "I don't know what she's talking about," she said, but her voice faltered at the end. Nicholas took a deep, frustrated breath. He felt like he was being thrown into a situation full of pieces that didn't fit. But for the first time in years, something inside him told him to wait, to be patient. Clara broke the silence. "Mr. Bennet, give her a chance. She needs help. I promise that when the time is right, you'll know everything." Nicholas remained silent, looking at the two women. Finally, he nodded, but there was a weight in his gaze. "Right, but I'm going to find out what's going on. And if they're lying to me, there'll be no second chance." Sophie ducked her head, and Nicholas felt discomfort growing inside him. He knew that tonight was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have imagined. As he went up to his room, leaving Clara to look after Sophie, he stopped in the hallway, glancing at the living room door one last time. "Who are you, Sophie?" he muttered to himself, before disappearing into the silence of the mansion. The rising sun bathed Nicholas's mansion in a faint light, the first rays escaping through the thick curtains and illuminating the hallway. He woke abruptly, the echo of thunder still ringing in his mind, even though the morning silence announced that the previous night's storm had finally ceased. For a moment he lay there, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to process the chaotic events that had turned his house into a haven for strangers. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. It was so out of character to have brought that woman and her babies into his meticulously controlled life, but something that night had moved him in a way he didn't understand. Perhaps it was the desperation in Sophie's eyes. Perhaps it was the deathly silence of the two newborns, too fragile to withstand the cold and rain. Or maybe it was something he didn't have the courage to admit, something he missed, but would never dare to say out loud. Feeling a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain, Nicholas threw the covers aside and stood up. The cold floor against his bare feet brought him back to reality. He put on a dark robe, tied it in a firm knot, and went downstairs. As soon as he set foot on the last step, a sound that hadn't been part of his home for a long time reached him. Babies crying. Nicholas stopped in the hallway, surprised. For years his mansion had been plunged into an oppressive silence, as if it echoed his own loneliness. But now it seemed that the house had come alive. Following the sound, he reached the living room and stopped in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the soft light coming through the windows. The scene before him caught him completely off guard. Sophie was sitting on the sofa, her hair messily tied up, but there was something charming about her simplicity. Despite the deep circles under her eyes, she had a slight smile on her lips. Nicholas was stunned to see Sophie with the little ones in each arm, breastfeeding them at the same time with care and dedication. The baby's crying had subsided, replaced by soft murmurs as they sucked on the milk. There was also music playing softly in the background, a calm, soothing melody that Nicholas couldn't identify, but which seemed to envelop the room in an aura of peace. It was such a striking contrast to the storm of the night before that, for a moment, he felt disconnected from his own reality. The room, which had always been a cold and empty place, now seemed warm and alive. Sophie's subtle laughter as she watched the babies, the little sounds they made, Clara's gaze on the scene. It was as if their home was breathing again. Nicholas leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He didn't say anything. He just watched. His heart was beating faster than he'd like to admit. He tried to rationalize what he was feeling. After all, he wasn't a man who got carried away by sentimentality, but he couldn't. The relief of knowing that those little ones had survived the night and were safe there was undeniable. He looked away for a moment, fighting a wave of emotion that caught him off guard. As he watched Clara and Sophie caring for the babies, buried memories began to surface, like a relentless tide that he couldn't hold back. He remembered Megan, his ex-wife. He remembered the nights when the two of them argued about children, or rather the lack of them. Since the beginning of their marriage, Nicholas had dreamed of being a father. He had always wanted a family, a home with children's laughter echoing through the corridors, a future in which he could teach, protect, love. But Megan never wanted that. "Children ruin everything, Nicholas," she would say, impassive, always running her hands through her perfect hair, arranged with the precision of someone who lived for appearances. "Do you know how much they cost? How much time they take away from us? And besides, have you thought about my body? I didn't go through so many surgeries to end it all because of a pregnancy." He remembered how much those words hit him, but he tried not to show it. He insisted, tried to talk, tried to make her understand how important this was to him. But Megan always put her own priorities above everything else: her career, her looks, her parties, her vanity. And then, after 5 years of an empty marriage, she walked out of his life without children, without explanation, and without looking back. Nicholas never completely got over it. He had convinced himself that perhaps not having children was his destiny. But at that moment, when he saw Sophie breastfeeding the babies and watching with hopeful eyes, something inside him was rekindled. A desire that he thought had been buried resurfaced. He approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt the scene before him. Sophie looked up when she heard him, and when their eyes met, he noticed that she seemed more rested, although she still carried a sadness that was impossible to ignore. "Good morning," said Nicholas, his voice softer than he had imagined. Sophie smiled slightly, and her eyes sparkled. "Good morning," she replied, her tone still shy but full of gratitude. Nicholas bent down to take a closer look at the babies. They were small, almost frighteningly fragile, but they seemed more alive now, their cheeks a little flushed. He reached out to touch the head of one of them, but hesitated at the last second, as if he feared hurting the child. "You saved their lives," Sophie said suddenly, her voice breaking. Nicholas looked up, surprised by the emotion he heard in her. "If it hadn't been for you, I don't even want to think about what would have happened." Nicholas tried to reply, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He just nodded, feeling an inexplicable tightness in his chest. After a few more seconds, he stood up and looked at Clara. "I'm going to the kitchen. We need to talk." Clara nodded, but he noticed that there was a discreet nervousness in her expression. She knew that the conversation he would demand was inevitable. Before leaving, Nicholas looked again at Sophie and the babies. Something inside him, a spark of something he hadn't felt for years, was slowly growing. He didn't know what was going on, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that his house and his life weren't as empty as before. He walked into the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Clara followed shortly after, drying her hands on a cloth. Nicholas turned to her, crossing his arms again, now with the serious look she knew well. "Now, Clara," he began, his voice firm but not cold, "I want answers." Clara hesitated, looking away briefly, as if seeking courage. But instead of speaking, she remained silent, leaving Nicholas even more intrigued. The silence in the kitchen seemed deafening, and Nicholas knew that what came next would change everything. Nicholas stared intensely at Clara, his arms crossed, his breathing heavy. He could see the conflict in her eyes. Clara was a straightforward, honest woman, but at that moment she seemed to be measuring every word before she spoke, as if she were afraid of dropping a bomb she couldn't control. "Clara, I'm waiting." His voice was firm, but he made a point of maintaining a less cold tone. He didn't want to frighten her, but his patience was running out. Clara let go of the dishcloth she was holding, throwing it on the counter. She crossed her hands in front of her, looking away for a moment before facing Nicholas again. "Mr. Bennett, I don't know how to say this, but I've seen this girl before," she began, her voice quavering. Nicholas raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What do you mean? Where did you see her?" Clara took a deep breath as if gathering the courage to continue. "She's not a complete stranger, at least not to me. She lived, or maybe still lives, in my neighborhood." "Your neighborhood?" He straightened up, puzzled. "Yes, it's a small neighborhood, you know. People know each other and, well, there's always gossip going from house to house," said Clara, in a tone that made it clear that she didn't like this kind of behavior, but also knew that it was impossible to avoid it. "I've seen this girl, Sophie, there a few times. Always discreet, with that shy way you saw yesterday. But there was something strange, something that people were talking about." Nicholas narrowed his eyes. "Strange how?" Clara paused long enough for him to start losing patience again, but before he could press her, she continued, "I heard she was married to a man who didn't seem very good." Nicholas frowned, the weight of Clara's words falling on him like a stone. "What do you mean he didn't seem good? Be clear, Clara." "Well," she began, fidgeting nervously, "people said they fought a lot, all the time. Some neighbors even commented that it was a dangerous kind of fight. You know, shouting, breaking objects, that sort of thing. And according to what I heard, after she came home from hospital, probably when she had the babies, things got worse. They say she and her husband were at war, but no one knew for sure why. It just seemed bad, very bad." Nicholas was silent for a few seconds, processing what Clara was saying. He wasn't the type to believe gossip, but there was something in the way she told the story that made him believe it wasn't just hearsay. "And you think she ran away from home because of that?" he asked, his voice now lower, but full of tension. Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. It's the only thing that makes sense. Why else would she be on that road, in the rain, with 2 week-old babies? She's desperate, that's clear. And if it's true what they say, then—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Nicholas knew exactly what she meant. He squeezed his eyes shut, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. He didn't know whether to be angry at being thrown into such a complicated situation, or to be worried. He didn't know Sophie, but he knew something was wrong, very wrong. "So she ran away to protect her children," he concluded, more to himself than to Clara. Clara shook her head in agreement. "I guess she did. That's what it looks like. But she needs to tell the truth, Mr. Bennett. We can't help her if she keeps hiding what's really going on." Nicholas took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair. He knew Clara was right, but he also knew that putting too much pressure on Sophie could be a mistake. She looked too fragile, as if she was on the verge of falling apart. "Let's go into the living room," he finally said. "We need to talk to her." Clara nodded, and the two of them walked in silence down the corridor to the living room. When they reached the door, the sight that greeted them was enough to make Clara stop midway, and Nicholas feel a tightness in his chest that he hadn't expected. Sophie was sitting on the same sofa as the night before, but now she was bent forward, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders were shaking, and it was obvious that she was crying. Even without hearing her sobs, Nicholas could feel the weight of the pain she was carrying. The 2 babies were nestled together in the makeshift corner Clara had made in the sofa. They were sleeping soundly, protected by the thick blanket Clara had provided. Soft music was still playing in the background, but now it seemed an almost cruel contrast to Sophie's scene. Nicholas stepped forward, his presence making Sophie suddenly raise her head. Her eyes were red, swollen, and when she saw that she wasn't alone, she tried to dry her tears quickly, but couldn't hide the despair that dominated her face. I'm sorry," she began, her voice breaking. "I know you've already done so much for me. I know you shouldn't, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm going to look after them, how I'm going to protect them." Nicholas and Clara exchanged a look. It was clear that she was on the edge. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to regain control. I just want them to be okay, that's all. Even if I have to disappear. The word disappear hung in the air like a silent threat, but Nicholas didn't let her continue. Disappear. Her voice was harsher than he had intended, but he had to interrupt her. What are you saying? Do you think that's going to solve anything? What about your children? Do you think they'll be better off without you? Sophie stared at him, surprised by the intensity of his words. For a moment, she didn't answer, but Nicholas realized that she was considering what he had said. Clara stepped forward, lightly touching Sophie's shoulder. You don't have to do this alone, darling, but you also need to trust us. Tell us what's really going on. How can we help you if we don't know what you're up against? Sophie looked away, her eyes full of tears again. She seemed about to say something, but hesitated, as if afraid that the truth would be too much for them. Nicholas felt the weight of the situation grow even heavier. He knew he was about to hear something that would change everything, but at the same time, he sensed that she wasn't yet ready to get it completely off her chest. You don't have to talk now, she finally said, her voice softer. But you need to understand that if you want to protect your children, you need help. Running away, hiding, that's not life. Not for you, not for them. Sophie nodded slowly, tears streaming silently down her face. Clara squeezed her shoulder affectionately, and Nicholas, as much as he didn't know how to act in situations like this, felt an unexpected wave of compassion. Rest for now, he said, turning to leave the room. When you're ready to talk, we'll be here. He returned to the kitchen, but this time his heart was heavy. Something inside him told him that the truth about Sophie would be much more complicated and painful than he had imagined. Nicholas was sitting at the kitchen table, his elbows resting on the cold marble worktop, his gaze lost in the half-empty cup of coffee in his hands. He wasn't a man used to losing control of a situation, but that morning was testing all the limits of his patience, and even more so, his ability to understand what was going on around him. Clara remained silent, leaning against the bench, watching him with an expression that mixed concern and expectation. She knew that Nicholas was deeply disturbed by Sophie's situation, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. He wasn't the kind of man who let his emotions show easily, but Clara could see in his eyes that something had changed since the night before. The sound of light footsteps echoed down the corridor, and then Sophie appeared at the kitchen door. Her eyes were still swollen from crying, and she looked hesitant, as if she was entering forbidden territory. Her arms were crossed against her chest in a defensive gesture, and she avoided looking directly at Nicholas or Clara. Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nicholas looked up immediately, setting his cup aside. There was something in her tone that made him straighten his posture, as if he knew that what was coming next wouldn't be easy to hear. "Of course, come in," he said, pointing to a chair at the table. Sophie hesitated for a moment, but eventually sat down, her hands restlessly in her lap. She seemed to be on the verge of falling apart again, and Nicholas realized that he would need all the patience he had to deal with what was to come. Clara, who was still leaning against the worktop, came over and pulled up a chair next to Sophie, gently holding one of her hands. "It's all right, darling, you can talk, we're here to help," said Clara, with a softness that contrasted with the oppressive silence of the kitchen. Sophie took a deep breath, but the air seemed trapped in her lungs. She looked at Nicholas, then at Clara, and then lowered her eyes, unable to maintain eye contact for long. I'm so sorry," she began, her voice breaking. "For everything. For coming here. For making trouble for you. I didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't mean to." Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Sophie, no one is blaming you, but you need to tell us what's going on. We can't help if you don't trust us." She nodded, but still seemed reluctant. After a few more seconds of torturous silence, she finally began to speak. "I had nowhere to go," she said, her voice breaking. "I was running away from my husband." Clara and Nicholas exchanged a quick glance, but remained silent, allowing her to continue. He's not a good person," Sophie continued, tears starting to run down her face. "I knew that from the start, but I was trapped. He manipulated me, controlled me, until I didn't know who I was anymore. He said I was nothing without him, that no one else would accept me, and I believed him." Clara squeezed her hand tighter, her eyes full of compassion. Nicholas, on the other hand, felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd heard stories like that before, but to hear it directly from Sophie, to see the pain in her eyes, was something he hadn't expected. "When I got pregnant, I thought things would change," she continued, her voice almost inaudible. "I thought that maybe with babies he would become someone better, but I was wrong. He got worse, much worse." Nicholas felt his fists clench instinctively. He didn't know exactly what Sophie meant by worse, but his mind began to fill in the gaps in a way that made him uncomfortably angry. "He shouted at me all the time," Sophie confessed, her voice now raspier, as if she was finally getting off her chest everything she had held in for so long. "He said I was useless. He told me to make the children stop crying at any cost. He said I was incapable of looking after the children, that I was ugly, that no one would ever love me. And sometimes he did more than shout." Clara put a hand to her mouth, shocked, while Nicholas felt a silent anger growing inside him. He couldn't bear the thought of someone treating Sophie like that, even more so while she was pregnant. "I put up with everything on my own. I accepted it. I was afraid to go out and be alone, and then, after the babies were born, it got even worse," she continued, now sobbing. "He said they were a burden, that we should never have had them. They were noisy. I knew that if I stayed there, something terrible would happen. So I waited. I waited until he left the house, and then I ran away, even in the rain. I was desperate and wanted to save my children from that environment." She stopped, covering her face with her hands while Clara tried to comfort her. Nicholas remained silent, but his heart was beating so hard that he felt it might explode. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed too small to deal with the magnitude of the suffering Sophie had faced. "You did what you needed to do," Clara said at last, her voice firm. "You protected your children. That's what matters." Sophie shook her head, still crying. "But I don't know what to do now. He'll look for me. He'll find me, I know he will, and I have nowhere to go. I have no money, I have nothing. I just want my children to be safe, that's all." Nicholas felt a pang in his chest. He had never considered himself a sentimental person, but something about Sophie, her vulnerability, her desperate strength to protect her children, touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He took a deep breath, straightened up in his chair and said, with a firmness that surprised even himself, "Sophie, you can stay here, for as long as you need. I won't let you and your children go back to a situation like this." Sophie looked up in surprise, and Clara let out a sigh of relief. "But," Nicholas continued, looking directly at Sophie, "I'm going to take some action. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. This isn't just about you, Sophie. I need to make sure I'm not bringing trouble into my life or my home." She nodded quickly, without question. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also an understanding that Nicholas was being fair. He stood up, adjusting his suit. "I need to go to work now, but I'm going to make some calls. We'll sort it out, Sophie, I promise." She watched him leave the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, felt that maybe, just maybe, she had found a safe place. In the car, Nicholas picked up the phone and called his lawyer, James. "James, I need you to prepare something for me. I have a temporary guest, and I want to make sure that everything is within the law. Also, I'm going to need you to do a bit of research on her. Her name is Sophie. I don't have her full surname yet, but I'll get it." "Understood, Mr. Bennett," replied James professionally. "Anything else?" Nicholas hesitated for a moment, but then decided, "Yes. I want you to hire a private investigator. I want to know everything about her husband. Who he is, where he is, what he does. I don't want any surprises. Leave it to me." Nicholas hung up and let out a heavy sigh. He knew he was getting involved in something much bigger than he had planned, but there was no turning back now. As he drove to the office, one thing was clear in his mind. He would do whatever it took to make sure Sophie and the babies were safe. Nicholas' working day was intense, but not for the usual reasons. His office, which was usually a haven of order and control, seemed more like a place of restlessness that morning. He tried to concentrate on meetings, contracts, and important decisions, but his mind always went back to the scene in the kitchen, to Sophie's eyes and the tears she was trying to hide. He didn't understand why it affected him so much. Sophie was a stranger, a woman who had appeared in his life by chance, carrying baggage that he had never asked her to carry. But at the same time, there was something about her, or perhaps about the two little beings who depended on her, that made him feel he had an obligation, not just to help her, but to protect her. Around midday, Nicholas's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was James, his lawyer. "Mr. Bennett, I made some preliminary calls about the case you mentioned this morning. I have some information to share." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, holding the phone tightly. "Go ahead." "I got her full name, Sophie Miller. She has no criminal record, which is a good sign. But there's not much about her in public records either. She seems to have led a fairly discreet life until now. Her husband, however, is another story." Nicholas felt his chest tighten. "What did you find on him?" "David Miller," replied James with a cautious tone. "He doesn't have a criminal record, but there are records of several emergency calls made by neighbors over the last 2 years, complaints of shouting, violent arguments, and the sound of objects being broken. However, none of the complaints have been taken further. And considering the justice system we have, you know what that means. She probably never wanted or managed to file a formal complaint." Nicholas closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. He could already imagine the scenario. Sophie trapped in a cycle of abuse, with no way out, no support, no hope. "Is he still around?" he asked, trying to keep his tone cool, but unable to completely hide the tension in his voice. "Yes, but here's what worries me. He filed a missing persons report 2 days ago, saying that his wife and children are missing. It's listed as a low-risk occurrence, but that means he's looking for her." Nicholas gripped the phone tightly. "Understood. Keep monitoring the situation, and I want you to hire private security for my house. I don't want to take any risks." "Leave it to me," replied James before hanging up. Nicholas sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the cityscape beyond his window. He felt a growing weight in his chest. Why was he getting so involved? Why did he care so much? He had no answers, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. When Nicholas arrived home that evening, the scene was very different from what he had expected. The living room, which in the morning had been full of life and soft music, now seemed shrouded in a cloud of tension. Clara was sitting in an armchair, her hands intertwined in her lap, while Sophie was standing by the window, looking out, completely motionless. She didn't realize he had come in until Clara cleared her throat to get her attention. Sophie turned around, and Nicholas saw immediately that something was wrong. Her eyes were red again, and she looked even more haggard than she had that morning. "Good evening," said Nicholas with a calm he didn't really feel. He looked at Clara. "Everything all right here?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Yes, Mr. Bennett, but Sophie was a bit agitated today. I think she's worried." Sophie lowered her head, and Nicholas took a few steps towards her. "What happened?" She shook her head, as if trying to clear away the thoughts that tormented her. "Nothing. I can't stop thinking that he's going to find us. He always finds a way. Always." There was a raw pain in her voice, and Nicholas felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest. He knew that her words were not just the result of fear, but of experience. "He won't find you," said Nicholas, his voice firm. "I've already made arrangements. You're safe here." Sophie looked up at him, as if she wanted to believe him, but something inside her stopped her. "You don't understand," she said, her tone almost desperate. "David, he won't give up. He always told me that if I tried to run away, he would find me, no matter where I was." Nicholas remained silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He knew he couldn't offer absolute guarantees, but he also knew he had enough resources to protect her and the babies. "Listen," he finally said, moving even closer. "I've hired private security for the house. Nobody goes in or out without me knowing, and I also have an investigator working to understand exactly who we're dealing with. I won't let anything happen to you or your children." Sophie stared at him, her eyes watering, and for a moment Nicholas thought she was going to collapse again. But instead she just nodded slowly, as if trying to convince herself that he was right. "Thank you," she murmured, almost inaudibly. Nicholas looked at Clara, who just nodded, indicating that she would take care of Sophie and the babies that night. He knew he needed to stay calm, but inside he felt a mixture of emotions that made him uneasy. He went into his home office and closed the door, picking up the phone again. He needed an update from James or the investigator he had hired, but before making the call he stopped and looked at the shelf of books in front of him. There, among the novels and biographies, was a forgotten picture frame with a photo of him and Megan, his ex-wife. He picked up the frame, looking at the picture for a long moment. She was radiant, with that smile that always seemed more fake than genuine. He stood next to her, serious, almost uncomfortable. For years he had believed that the failure of that marriage had been his fault. Perhaps he had expected too much, dreamed too much, wished for something that Megan would never be able to offer. But now, as he thought about Sophie and what she had endured, he realized that Megan had never understood the true value of a family, what it meant to really care about someone. He put the picture frame back on the shelf, feeling a new determination grow inside him. Sophie and her children were everything Megan had never been, real, vulnerable, human. He would do whatever it took to make sure they were safe, not out of obligation, but because somehow he felt it was the right thing to do. With that in mind, he picked up the phone and dialed the investigator's number to get more information. And James, as always, was direct and efficient. "I've already applied for a protective order," said James. And considering the circumstances, it wasn't difficult to get one. The police have already been informed, and David Miller is now legally prohibited from going near Sophie and the children. If he tries, he'll be arrested immediately. Nicholas let out a long sigh, feeling a wave of relief. "That's a start. Great work, James. Keep watching closely. I want to be informed of anything." "Of course, Mr. Bennett. They now have the protection of the law." "You can relax a bit," James replied before ending the call. Nicholas left the phone on the table and rubbed his face with his hands. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but he knew that didn't mean the danger was over. The protective order was an important barrier, but he still needed to be vigilant. David was clearly unpredictable, and men like him rarely followed rules. With this thought in mind, Nicholas left his office and went into the living room. Clara was sitting on the sofa holding one of the babies, who was crying softly, while Sophie tried to calm the other. The scene was sweet chaos, Clara and Sophie working together to reassure the little ones, while an atmosphere of warmth and care filled the room. "James got the protective order," said Nicholas, interrupting the scene. His firm voice caught the attention of the two women. Sophie looked at him in surprise. "He did?" "Yes," he confirmed, crossing his arms. "David is forbidden to come near you or the babies, and if he tries, he'll be arrested." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She clasped the baby in her arms against her chest and let out a deep sigh, as if, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe without fear. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Nicholas replied simply. "The important thing is that you're safe." Clara, who was cradling the other baby in her arms, also looked relieved. "That's great news, Mr. Bennett. I think Sophie will be able to sleep a little better tonight." Nicholas looked at Sophie and the babies, and for the first time he felt he was doing something really important. Not just for their safety, but for something bigger, something he couldn't yet name. Later that evening, Nicholas was in the hallway, walking towards the room Clara had prepared for Sophie and the babies. He wanted to check on them before he went to bed. When he slowly opened the door, the scene he found paralyzed him. The room was illuminated by a soft light, and the makeshift crib Clara had set up was positioned next to Sophie's bed. The two babies slept side by side, their little chests rising and falling in quiet breathing. Clara had done a careful job of decorating the space simply, but there was something welcoming about it. Nicholas took a few steps into the room and stopped next to the crib. He stared at the two babies for a few seconds, completely fascinated. They were so small, so fragile, but at the same time so full of life. Every movement, the stretching out of their little hands, the almost inaudible murmur that one of them made in its sleep, seemed charged with a purity that he had never seen before. He knelt beside the crib, looking at the peaceful faces of the little ones. The silence of the room was interrupted only by their soft breathing, and Nicholas felt something inside him that he couldn't explain. A wave of emotion, something deep and overwhelming. He had always wanted to be a father, always wanted the chance to build a family, but Megan only cared about herself, her looks, traveling. She said that children were an unnecessary burden, and that he should be content with the life they had. For years, Nicholas believed that this dream was lost forever, but now, looking at those two little faces, he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. An uncontrollable need to protect them, to ensure that nothing would ever hurt them. He reached out and gently touched the little hand of one of the babies. It was warm, delicate, and the baby reacted by squeezing its fingers against his. Nicholas felt his eyes sting, but he blinked rapidly, trying to dispel the emotion that threatened to overflow. "You'll be fine," he whispered, more to himself than to the babies. "I promise." Suddenly, he heard a slight movement behind him and turned his head. Sophie was standing in the doorway, watching in silence. She had her arms crossed, and a small, shy smile was on her lips. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice soft. Nicholas stood up slowly, straightening his posture, but he didn't feel embarrassed that she had seen him like that. He shook his head. "You didn't interrupt. I just wanted to see how they were." Sophie entered the room, walking slowly to the crib. She looked at her children with eyes full of love, but when she looked up at Nicholas, he saw something else. Gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for what you're doing," she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what would have become of us if you hadn't stopped on that road last night." Nicholas shook his head again. "No need to thank me, Sophie. Anyone would have done the same." She smiled slightly but shook her head in denial. "No, not anyone would have done what you did. God brought me to you. I'm sure of it." Nicholas didn't know how to respond. He wasn't a religious man, but there was something in her words that touched a part of him he didn't even know existed. The two of them stood in silence for a few seconds, looking at the peacefully sleeping babies. It was a simple moment, but one filled with meaning. As Nicholas left the room, he realized that this promise to protect Sophie and their children was no longer just a responsibility. It was something he wanted to do, something he needed to do. The weeks turned into months, and Nicholas's house, once a cold and empty place, now pulsed with a life he had never imagined. Clara's laughter, the sounds of babies crawling and discovering the world, and even the clatter of dishes as Sophie helped in the kitchen, transformed every corner of the mansion into something vibrant. It was as if, for the first time in years, Nicholas was living, not just existing. Right at the start, the investigator Nicholas had hired brought news that helped ease some of the tension that still hung in the air. David Miller, the man who so terrified Sophie, had been arrested after getting involved in a fight in his neighborhood. The news was an indescribable relief for Sophie. At last, she and her babies were safe. There were no more shadows of her past haunting her. Nicholas received the news with a mixture of relief and determination. He knew the battle for safety was over, but the new fight was different. He wanted to see Sophie happy, truly happy. As the months passed, Nicholas became more and more involved with the twins. The sound of their childish laughter was music to his ears, and he came to cherish every moment he had with them. Whenever he could, he would leave work early just to sit on the living room floor and play with the little ones, as they crawled towards their toys, or sometimes just to climb on top of him, as if he were a mountain. He never imagined that two such little beings could bring so much joy into his life. Clara had also become an important support point for Sophie, who saw her as a kind of second mother. The two would talk at length in the kitchen, while Sophie helped prepare meals or fold clothes. During one of these conversations, Sophie confessed something she had been holding back for weeks. "Clara," Sophie began, hesitantly, as she held up a folded shirt, "I think I'm in love with Nicholas." Clara, who was stirring a pot on the stove, stopped immediately and turned to her, a smile forming on her lips. "And what's wrong with that, darling? You should be." Sophie turned red and lowered her eyes. "But I don't know if he feels the same way. He's already done so much for me and my children. I don't want him to think I'm confusing gratitude with love." Clara giggled and put her hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Oh, Sophie, darling, have you seen the way he looks at you? Or rather, how he looks at babies? Nicholas has changed. I've worked for him for years and I've never seen him as happy as he is now. But men like him, sometimes they need a little push to realize what's right in front of them." Sophie laughed a little nervously, but Clara's encouragement gave her a little more confidence. As the weeks went by, she began to take more care of herself. She fixed her hair, wore nicer dresses, and even put on a bit of makeup, something she hadn't done since long before the twins were born. And little by little, she noticed that Nicholas was changing too. Nicholas began to spend less and less time at work, preferring to be at home. He couldn't explain it, but something pulled him to that place, to those people. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of his loneliness, was now a home. He liked waking up to the sound of babies babbling in the next room, going down to breakfast and seeing Sophie helping Clara in the kitchen, seeing the little ones crawling around the living room and laughing when he picked them up. And then there was Sophie. He began to notice the little details, how she looked at him when she thought he wasn't seeing, how her smile lit up the room, how her presence made everything lighter. He tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was just admiration for what she had overcome. But the more time passed, the more he knew it was something more. Nicholas, a man who had always prioritized work, now found himself making excuses to stay at home. He spent afternoons playing with the babies, helping Sophie carry them or simply chatting with her in the living room while Clara cooked. And for the first time in many years, he felt he had found something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: peace. One evening, Clara and Sophie decided to organize a small dinner party under the pretext of celebrating the twins' 7th birthday. Clara, with her experienced manner, was the one to come up with the idea. "Leave everything to me, Sophie," she said, winking. "The babies are going to bed early and I'll keep an eye on them in their room. You two need a moment to yourselves." Sophie was nervous, but she trusted Clara. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress and pinned her hair up in a way that Clara insisted was irresistible. When Nicholas came down for dinner, she was just finishing setting the table, and he paused for a moment when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said sincerely, but also with a little hesitation. Sophie smiled, trying to hide how much those words affected her. "Thank you. And you're, well," she joked, drawing a laugh from Nicholas. Dinner was simple, but there was something in the air, a light, sweet tension, as if they both knew something was about to change. They talked about babies, about how much they had grown, about the first words they were probably about to say. Nicholas told stories about his childhood, something he rarely did, and Sophie listened attentively, as if every word was precious. When they had finished eating, they sat in silence for a moment, just looking at each other. It was Nicholas who broke the silence. "Sophie," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I don't know if I've ever told you this, but you changed my life. You changed my life. Before you arrived, I thought I was fine. But looking back, I see that I was just surviving. Now with you and the babies here, I feel like I'm finally living." Sophie felt tears fill her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me, Nicholas. You've given me more than security. You gave me a new chance to be happy." He stood up slowly and walked over to her, holding out his hand. Sophie took it, and he pulled her closer. For a moment they just stared at each other, their faces so close that she could feel his breathing. "I think fate put me on that road that night," said Nicholas with a small smile. "And looking at you now, I thank God for that." And then, as if it were all natural, he bent his head and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, full of everything they hadn't said up to that point. When they parted, Sophie's face was flushed, but she was smiling. Clara, who was peeking discreetly through the door, gave a satisfied smile and went back into the bedroom, where the babies were sleeping peacefully. The family she had so longed to see was now a reality. Months later, Nicholas, Sophie, the twins, and Clara were in the garden, laughing as the children took their first steps. The mansion, once a symbol of solitude, was now full of life, full of love. Nicholas knew that despite all the challenges, he had found something he had always wanted: a family. And for the first time in a long time, he was truly happy. Did you like the story? How would you rate it from 0 to 10? Leave us your opinion in the comments. We really want to know how this story touched you. Don't forget to leave a like to support our work, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive more stories full of drama, overcoming, and love. Now check out the next video that pops up on your screen. I'm sure it will move you too.